What if the punishment they chose for you turned out to be the one thing that made you unstoppable? They threw a man into an ocean of sand and called it an execution. They had no idea they had just armed him. Somewhere in a desert with 2 moons in its sky, shackles hit the ground, and a stranger's body opens its eyes for the first time. That body belongs to a man named Dan Caro, branded on the wrist as an outcast, a sandmudge, the lowest rank of magic anyone in this world has ever heard of. But the mind behind those eyes isn't from this world at all. It belongs to a 26-year-old geological engineer who once studied dune stabilization in Arizona. A storm, a skidding car, a canyon, darkness, and now sand under his cheek, cold and wrong. A guard kicks him and shouts words he's never heard, yet somehow understands. Get out, you're on your own now. The law says the iron must come off, so the exile can die a free man. The cart creaks away, the lantern fades, and Dan is alone under a sky with 2 moons. He looks at his own hands, long fingers, dark skin, not his hands at all. Panic rises, but the engineer in him refuses to panic for long. He scoops up a handful of sand, and something in him reads it instantly. Quartz, medium grain, about 3% moisture, 6 hours until dawn. And then the grains do something they shouldn't. They obey him. Just barely. But they obey. A stolen memory floats up. Sand magic. Lowest rank useless. Exiled to die. Dan almost laughs. They banished a man who understands sand to a world made entirely of it. He presses his palm into the ground and feels magic reach downward like roots thin weak, but real. 3 meters. 5, 10, 15. And then limestone. He has a lever now. A small one, but a lever. He walks all night, because stopping in this desert means never waking up again. At dawn the wind shifts, and he smells something that isn't water yet, but moisture. A twisted gray cactus, roots angled toward something. An ancient dry riverbed. He follows it for hours until he sees tents, a stone well, and desperate faces. An old man asks who he is. Dan answers in a language his body somehow knows. An outcast. A sandwich. The old man says, "We're dying too. The well has been dry for a week." Dan presses his palm to the earth beside it and counts downward through the layers. 18 meters down. There is water, but the well was dug for meters off for meters. That doomed them. He marks a new spot with a scrap of chain. Dig here. Stop at 18 meters. The old man looks at him like he's mad, then looks at his dying children and starts digging anyway. By the second day, a chill rises from the pit. By noon, water runs clear and cold. The old man, Haris Al-Safa, places his own knife in front of Dan without a word. Dan doesn't know it yet, but in this world, a knife that means something closer to family than gift. He falls asleep. That night for the first time in 2 days, a stranger's blade in his hand, under 2 moons. When he wakes, the camp that was dying yesterday is alive today. But a well without reinforcement will collapse in weeks. And Dan already knows exactly what this world is missing: glass. He mixes sand with ash from the fire pit and channels magic into it, not to move it, but to heat it from the inside. His palm blisters as the grains fuse into a rough, bubbled, ugly, beautiful piece of glass. Old Haris turns it over in the sunlight, and for the first time, his face isn't surprise, it's understanding. They build a real furnace. Dan teaches guides, nudges the fire rather than doing all the work with his own blood. A ring of glass seals the mouth of the well. Not pretty, but it holds. A girl named Dila wipes the blood from his face and asks what the substance is called. His mouth answers in words that aren't his own. Frozen light. Days later he grinds a crude lens and lets sunlight burn through it, setting dry grass smoldering in seconds. It isn't magic, he tells Ela. It's physics. She listens the way people here listen to prophets. And Dan realizes he has already become something he never asked to be. Then the men who went searching for water return empty-handed, having lost one of their own to a storm. Their leader Rashid spits at the word sandwich. He has heard his whole life that they are worthless. Dan hands him a crooked lens and tells him to look through it. Rashid sees the lines of his own palm magnified 10 times over, and something in his eyes changes. He sets a test. Today's south, a place called the Dry Bowl, dead for 60 years. Find water there, and he'll believe. Dan agrees because in this world trust isn't given with words, it's given with water. They travel for a day and a half across sand that swallows every foot that isn't careful. At sunset the Dry Bowl opens before them. A vast flat, lifeless plate half a kilometer wide. Dan stands barefoot on the sand and closes his eyes, pushing his awareness down through the layers of the earth. 5 meters sand, 20. Dead clay. But past it, deeper still, something enormous. An underground lake, 35 meters down. Vast, cold, untouched for 60 years. Blood runs from his nose, and his ear from the strain. But he has an idea. Now, not a well, a pipe. An engineer doesn't dig. When the depth is impossible, an engineer builds pressure a path to follow. He spends days melting glass tubes by the dozen, welding them end to end with fire and magic. On the 4th day, he has 35 meters of crooked, ugly, unbreakable glass pipe. He drives it down centimeter by centimeter with magic alone, guiding it blind through sand and clay. At 35 meters, resistance vanishes. The pipe punches through into open water. For a moment, nothing, then a low hum, like a sigh from beneath the world. Water bursts from the top of the pipe and shoots 3 meters into open air. Rashid stands frozen, watching water fall onto sand that hasn't felt rain in 60 years. He walks over, drinks from his own cupped hands, and asks Dan only one word. How? Dan answers with words Rashid can't understand, and a meaning he understands perfectly. He brought the water back. That night, Rashid tells him about another clan to years without an oasis, dying one person every month. Dan looks into the fire and understands this is no longer about one well, it's becoming infrastructure. He nods. I'll do it. They return to camp, and Hila meets them at the tents. She sees the wet water skins and says nothing, but her eyes shine. Old Hari's tastes water from the new source and says it reminds him of his childhood. Dan sits with him and Rashid and draws in the sand a road, a dome to stop evaporation, and a third point south. A triangle, 3 wells, 3 roads, the beginning of something that has never existed in this desert before. Rashid rides to bring back the other clan. Dan begins building the road alone, pressing sand into stone one stretch at a time. On the 3rd day, Hila starts walking beside him without asking permission. Someone has to make sure you don't die, she says. She teaches him the desert. He teaches her that her knowledge is worth more than anyone ever told her. 10 days later, Rashid returns with 12 starving people from the Banu Najim clan, and a boy with cracked lips, who drinks like the world is ending. Their warrior Qasim walks to days to see the dry bowl fountain with his own eyes, and laughs for the first time in years. When he sees it, 25 people now work 3 fronts at once. A road, a camp, and a supply chain built from nothing. By the end of the 3rd week, the road is finished. A 2-day journey cut down to 1. Hila says the road needs a name. Dan calls it the first line, and for the first time, she smiles. A month has passed since he fell out of a cart in chains. He has found the water sources, built a road, and made his first allies. But this morning, Hila spots a rider on a horse alone, watching the camp from a distant dune. A horse in the desert means only one thing. Verdania has found them. Qasim grabs a spear, certain the rider will kill anyone who approaches. Dan walks out alone anyway, hands empty and armed. He sits down on open sand 100 meters from the rider and waits. 2 minutes. 5. The rider comes closer. It's a woman. Red hair, green eyes, a crossbow leveled straight at his chest. She demands his name and rank. He answers with a stranger's memory, an exile, a sandmudge, lowest school. She asks about the well, the glass, the road, and Dan tells her the truth, because lying to a loaded crossbow rarely helps. She lowers the weapon, though she doesn't put it away, and says her name is Hannah O'Brien, captain of the 3rd Border Outpost. She has to report everything she's seen, then already knows what that means. He offers her water anyway. She drinks, waters her horse, stares at the glistening well behind him like something impossible, and rides north without another word. Qasim asks why he let her go. Dan says they have no reason for war. Qasim says Verdania already has one reason: they're alive. That night Dan gathers all 25 of them and tells them soldiers are coming. Not this week, maybe not this month, but they are coming. Not war, he says, defense. A wall no horse can climb, and no army can rush through in one piece. He spends 2 weeks growing a dune wall out of nothing but compacted sand, collapsing afterward each night in a pool of his own blood and sweat. Hila drags him into a tent each morning, wipes the blood from his face, and comes back to work beside him every single night without fail. By the 2nd week, the wall stands 4.5 meters high, curved smooth, with a single narrow entrance that turns 3 times. Standing on top of it, Dan looks north toward a kingdom slowly drying up, and south toward 25 people, who now have something to defend. Ela asks what the camp should be called. Dan looks at the golden glass dome catching the last light of sunset. Mirror Oasis, he says. And for the first time since he's known her, she smiles like she means it completely. A month later, Mirror Oasis has 42 people, and the Bonanajim clan arrives in full. 50 more, with a chieftain who trusts water, not miracles. Salem tests the fountain himself, drinks, and agrees to stay. Not because he believes in Dan, but because the water is real. Dan finally has enough hands to work 3 fronts at once. A road, a proper furnace, and something he calls a school. He teaches soil and water by firelight. Ela teaches navigation. Anyone can sit and listen, children, adults, anyone at all. A boy named Tariq, the same child with cracked lips from the very first well, sits through every single lesson without missing one. He is a dustmudge, the lowest of the low, told his whole life that his power is a curse rather than a gift. Dan tells him to place his palm on the sand and listen. On the 7th try, the boy whispers that he feels something far below, like a rumble. That's the water table. Dan tells him, and watches a boy discover for the first time that he isn't useless. He's entrained. Within weeks, 8 students study under him. Dust mages, mist mages, sand mages, every power the world called worthless. Dan doesn't say their gifts were always valuable. He simply gives each of them a task built for exactly what they can do. By the 2nd month, a 3rd oasis is found, and the triangle of roads is finally complete. 3 points, 3 wells, 1 network. But Rashid returns from the north with worse news. Rumors of the desert have reached Verdania's capital, and someone there is listening. The scout Hannah was stripped of her rank for reporting what she saw, punished for telling the truth. Dan feels something close to guilt. Qasim warns that a full detachment is coming next. Not 1 rider. Dan says the wall will. By the time they still don't have enough of. So, he does what he doesn't want to do. He heads deeper south, toward the Banu Zahir, the desert's largest warrior clan, 400 strong. Their old chieftain is dead, killed by a rival clan over a salt trail. His daughter Nura now leads in his place, and she doesn't listen to Outcast. She meets them with 10 riders and a spear-straight refusal, until Dan mentions water, then glass, then a road that could save her wounded. She stops walking away. She gives him 1 day to prove himself worth her time. At her camp, the well is nearly dry. The goats are starving. The camels are patient in the only way camels know how to be. Dan drops to his knees and digs a shaft with nothing but his hands and his magic, while 200 people watch in complete silence. 3 hours pass, then 5. At 20 meters, water glitters at the bottom of a perfectly smooth shaft. Nura looks down into it, then looks at Dan and asks if he can teach others to do what he just did. He can't teach the magic, he says, but he can teach people to read the land, and he can build for anyone who joins his confederation. She says her clan kneels for no one. Dan tells her he isn't asking her to kneel. He's asking her to stand beside him. She says she'll think about it, and Qasim quietly tells Dan that for Nura, that's practically a yes already. 2 weeks later, a single word arrives from her camp, come. Dan returns with warriors' workers, and for camels loaded with glass. Not as a beggar this time, but as an ally bearing gifts. Nura sets 1 condition before she'll join. When the clan that murdered her father eventually comes crawling for water, she gets to be the one who judges them. Dan agrees. 400 warriors join the confederation in a single afternoon, without ceremony, without bloodshed, without a single oath spoken aloud. Her people bring more than spears. Blacksmith starts forging arrowheads from Dan's glass, razor sharp and nearly invisible in flight. Nura sees the first glass arrowhead and smiles, just for a flash. But Dan notices it. Months of work follow, new oases, new roads. Ela becomes his memory of the land. He becomes her way of finding water no one else can find. One night by the fire, she tells him quietly that her father once traded her for the water skins to an old chieftain who died before the wedding. Dan says nothing useful, because there's nothing useful to say. Instead, he shapes a small glass bowl by hand, the finest thing he's ever made. He tells her it's worth more than the water skins, more than 200, because she deserves something beautiful for no reason at all. She wears it on her belt every day after that, in plain sight, unashamed. And without knowing it, she starts a tradition that will spread through the entire Confederation. A week later, someone climbs a 4-meter glass wall that should be unclimbable, and a sentry catches a stranger halfway to Dan's tent holding a glass knife. Her name is Yenalim 22. From Dan's own world, stranded here for 5 years, and utterly certain he's either the real thing or a corpse by morning. Dan answers her in English, using words no one in this world could possibly know. Capillary action, filtration coefficient. She lowers the knife and cries for the first time in 5 years of complete isolation. She tells him everything. An order obsessed with water magic, a grandmaster named Silas Moreland, who tried to use her like a tool, 3 years running hiding, surviving alone. She's found something in an old scroll too. Something about a sleeping well. An ancient structure drawing water from across the entire continent. The well is going wrong, drawing more and more, drying rivers 1,000 kilometers away. And only sand magic, never water magic, can put it back to sleep. That's why the Order hunts sand mages. Yena says, not because they're useless, because they're the only ones dangerous enough to end the system forever. Dan asks if she'll work with him, not for him. And for the first time in 5 years, someone treats her as an equal instead of a tool or a threat. She agrees, on one condition, a school of her own, to teach real chemistry disguised as alchemy, so the knowledge never dies with her. Within weeks, soap ends a wave of sickness among the children. Simple glass filters make well water taste clean for the first time in memory. 6 months in, the Confederation has grown to 5 clans, 180 people, a working glass economy, and blue glass beads used as currency across the desert. Every problem solved seems to birth to more. Politics. 5 chieftains. 5 different visions for what this desert should become. Dan calls the first council under open sky. He proposes one law. Water belongs to everyone. Roads belong to everyone. Disputes are settled by council, never by the sword. Nira tells him a builder without a vote is a slave, and slaves don't build states. They just work for someone else's. She gives him a seat at the table himself. A week later, 30 starving riders appear on the northern road, not Verdania. Worse, the very clan that murdered Nira's father, begging for water. Nira's knuckles go white around her spear. Dan tells her there are children among them. She says her father's killer is among them too. She lets them in anyway, gives them water first, because there's no point judging the dead. 3 days later, at trial, the chieftain kneels before her and admits his guilt without excuse. 200 people watch in silence. Nira raises her spear, and instead of a killing blow, drives it into the sand beside his knee. One word: exile. Him alone. His people stay. That night she tells Dan she wanted to kill him for 3 months straight, but couldn't, because doing it would make her exactly what she despises. A year into this world, the Confederation counts 7 clans, 400 people, 3 fortresses, and a growing economy built entirely from sand and light. A dying girl named Emma Carson is carried into camp half a step from death, daughter of a disgraced Verdanian noble, exiled for defending sand mages of all people. She spends her first weeks hating everything about the desert and everyone in it, then slowly, painfully stops. Dan discovers she's a wind mage, considered near useless back home, and hands her the one job that actually needs exactly her gift: mapping wind for every wall he builds. Within a month she's kneeling in the sand directing construction crews with a voice that doesn't shake anymore. An engineer, Yena says, has been born from an aristocrat. The Confederation's first true border fortress rises soon after. 8 meters of glass-veined sand. A message to anyone watching from across the border. A year and a half in, rumors of the desert have reached the capital itself, and Grandmaster Silas Moreland reads every detail with a rising private fear. He knows about the sleeping well. His order is guarded. That's secret for 3 centuries. As both a weapon and a nightmare. Depending on who controls it, only a sand mage can touch it safely. And now an uncontrollable one is out there, building a state instead of dying quietly in the sand like he was supposed to. Moreland sends a punitive force, 20 water mages, 50 guards, commanded by a fanatic named Doran, who believes every word of the Order's doctrine. Dan learns of their approach 3 weeks early from a dust mage student, who can feel hoofbeats through the ground itself from kilometers away. He refuses an ambush, no deaths, he says, and instead spends 3 days redesigning an entire mountain pass into a trap made of sand and glass. The soldiers march confident, and march straight into a maze of sinking sand, collapsing walls, and glass-slick surfaces that swallow every drop of water magic they throw at it. Trapped in a 100-meter square, with glass walls 6 meters high, Doran screams that lower mages never surrender to higher ones. Dan simply waits. 3 days later, with their water running out, 70 soldiers walk out unarmed, given water for the road home, and not a single life lost on either side. Rumors of a bloodless victory over the Order's finest spread across the entire continent faster than any caravan could carry them. 2 years in, 12 clans and 1,000 people call the Confederation home. Trade agreements arrive from neighboring emirates with actual seals and signatures. Hannah O'Brien returns on a stolen horse, having quit an army that called her crazy for telling the truth about what she saw in the desert. She becomes a military advisor, and slowly, painfully, learns to work alongside Nura, two strong women who start out as rivals and end up as something closer to family. A month later, Dan finally travels east toward the Silent Sands, chasing the location of the sleeping well itself. 5 days out, the wind dies completely, the sand turns fine as flour and stops moving entirely, as if time itself had paused there. They find a plane of ancient fused glass, and at its center, a massive glass dome, cracked at the apex, steam rising from the wound. Dan presses his palm against it, and the entire desert seems to breathe through his hand for one unbearable second. He sees a green world, rivers, cities of white stone, a well built to give endless water, and the exact moment it began to take instead of give, he sees people lying down in glass coffins on purpose, hoping someone someday would come back and finish what they couldn't. Blood pours from his nose and ears. Yenna catches him as he falls, screaming his name until he tells her he's alright. He isn't, but he's alive. Underground, in a hall of shattered, empty coffins, they find exactly one that still glows faintly blue, and inside it, a sleeping girl. 3 days later, Dan pulls the glass lid open, and a girl named Sora wakes up screaming, because the last thing she remembers is the end of her entire world. She is the daughter of the well's last keeper, and she knows something no scroll ever recorded. The well isn't water magic, it's structure, it's sand. Only sand magic can rebuild the spiral inside it into a closed loop, and stop it from drawing water forever. Her own father, the most powerful midge in his civilization's history, couldn't do it. He wasn't a geologist, Dan is. News arrives sooner than anyone hoped. King Alistair Vane has declared a crusade against the desert with an army of 40,000. Nura vows every warrior of her clan will die on their feet rather than flee. Dan raises a hand and says no one has to die at all. He needs 2 months. He gets 2. For 2 months straight, Dan barely sleeps, splitting himself between 2 impossible projects at once. The first is a valley 3 days north, the only passage an army this size can take, and Dan redesigns its entire floor beneath. A thin layer of ordinary sand underneath. 1 kilometer of solid mirror glass waits to blind an army, flanked by dunes rigged to move on command, and squeeze an army toward the center. The second project is the well itself. Every third night he goes alone to the Silent Sands, and studies a spiral of quartz thousands of tons heavy, spinning with monstrous, gathering force. The flaw isn't malice, it's resonance. Feedback with no break, growing stronger the more water it steals. The fix is elegant and terrifying at once. Join the 2 open ends of the spiral into a single unbroken ring. At the very bottom, under pressure that could crush stone. A week before the battle, the solution is finished on paper. The execution will require going down into the well itself. At dawn, 40,000 soldiers enter the valley. Dan stands on a hill with 5 people beside him and closes his eyes. He offers surrender first, no deaths. He says. The king's advisor shakes his head. The king orders the charge. The moment cavalry crosses the field, the sand parts, and a kilometer of mirrored glass flashes in the morning sun, blinding rider after rider at once. Wind carries fine glass dust across the formation. Dunes begin to move, not to crush, but to squeeze 40,000 people into a space with nowhere left to run. The battle lasts 3 hours. 9 people die, all from falls and stray arrows. Not one death comes from magic, and not one comes by Dan's order. He walks across his own glass field to stand 5 paces from a humiliated king and a furious grandmaster. Moreland insists the natural order requires water above and sand below, that it has always been this way, and always should be. Dan tells him the well cannot be redirected, only closed or opened, and opening it destroys everyone. The desert and Verdania both. That isn't magic, he says. That's geology. The king, staring at his broken army, and 1,000 silent nomads on the dunes above him, agrees to recognize the Confederation as a neighbor, not an enemy. 40,000 soldiers march home in disgrace. Dan feeds and frees 3,000 wounded stragglers the very next morning. No exceptions, no conditions. Then he walks east alone, toward the silent sands, toward the well, because the real work was never finished. Hila wants to come. He tells her no. She understands exactly what that means, and lets him go anyway. Kissing the palm he presses against the sand. 3 days later, deep inside the well, he finds the spirals to open ends, separated by a 2-meter gap under pressure. That could shatter bone. He sits down, places both palms against ancient quartz, and begins to build the connection atom by atom, exactly the way an engineer builds anything that has to last forever. 12 hours pass. Blood runs from his nose, his ears, his eyes. His body is screaming to stop. He doesn't stop, because stopping means never starting again. The final centimeter closes, the spiral becomes a ring. The vibration stops, the pressure drops, and for the first time in centuries, the well goes completely, perfectly silent. He lies on the floor, unable to move, unable to feel his own hands, and somehow still smiling, because it worked. 2 days later, Hila finds him, having followed his footprints the entire way without telling him she would. She pours water into his mouth, and waits until he wakes. He opens his eyes at sunset to her face. She calls him an idiot. He says Yenna should have said that first. She says Yenna would agree. But she said it first. The catastrophe is over. The water that was disappearing across an entire continent has finally stopped disappearing. A year later, the rivers of Verdania have stopped shrinking. No one there knows why yet. Dan isn't in a hurry to tell them. 3 years have passed since a man in chains fell out of a cart onto cold sand. What stands here now is no longer a camp. It's a city. 12 clans, for 1,000 people, 22 oases connected by roads that never crack, because everything Dan builds is built to last. A boy named Tariq, 14 now, teaches his own students how to read the ground better than Dan ever could explain it. Emma Carson maps the wind for every new wall built. Yenna writes the first chemistry textbook this world has ever seen, and calls it simply How the World Works. Hannah and Nura run the border together, to women who started as rivals, and now finish each other's plans without needing to ask. Silas Moreland vanished from his tower one night, and was never seen again. Dan suspects the world hasn't heard the last of him, but that's a story for another day. Sora lives beside Dan's workshop, still 16 forever, teaching the children what a green world once looked like before it broke. Small springs have begun breaking through the sand in 4 places across the Confederation's land. Not a flood, just water returning, the way it always should, slowly, drop by drop. Hila still wears the same glass bowl on her belt every single day. The very first thing he ever made just for her, worth more than anything that could be traded. This evening, a merchant brings 3 date palm saplings, and Hila wants to plant them by the school, in ground that would have laughed at the idea 3 years ago. Dan digs the first hole with his own hands. Hila plants the second. Tariq, gentle and careful, plants the third, exactly as he was taught. They stand together, as the sun sets over glass domes glowing gold, over roads stretching to a horizon that used to mean only death. 2 moons rise together in the darkening sky. The very first thing Dan ever saw in this world, and now simply home. He says quietly, in a language she doesn't speak, that the real work begins now. She doesn't need the words. She only needs his hand in hers, and she holds it tighter. A man exiled to die in an ocean of sand became the reason that ocean learned how to breathe again. Not with magic, with patience, with knowledge, with water found 1 grain at a time, and never once given up on. The desert didn't save him. He saved it slowly. The same way everything worth building gets built, grain by grain, day by day, forever.